August 1944, northern France. The dust rising from the roads south of Normandy hung in the late summer air as a German reconnaissance officer stood beside a battered field car, binoculars raised toward the horizon. The Allied breakout from Normandy had already begun pushing German forces eastward, and reconnaissance units were being sent constantly to observe the speed of the American advance. Through his binoculars, the officer watched the road stretching across the countryside, and what he saw at first seemed almost absurd. The road was filled with trucks. Not a few trucks, hundreds of them. Long columns of American transport vehicles rolled forward in a constant line that seemed to disappear over the horizon. Engines roared, tires kicked up dust, and the convoy stretched mile after mile across the countryside. The officer lowered his binoculars and shook his head with a small laugh. To him, the scene looked wasteful and inefficient. German military doctrine had always emphasized careful use of resources. Fuel was precious, and vehicles were used sparingly whenever possible. Railways carried most heavy supplies, while trucks were reserved for shorter distances near the front. But the Americans seemed to operate differently. These trucks burned enormous amounts of gasoline just to move basic supplies across the countryside. From the German perspective, it looked reckless. The officer turned to another soldier nearby and made a sarcastic remark about the American Army's appetite for fuel. "They move everything by truck," he said, watching the convoy continue rolling forward. "They must burn more fuel in a day than we use in a week." The assumption seemed logical. The further an army advanced from its supply bases, the harder it became to keep fuel, ammunition, and food moving forward. Supply lines stretched longer and longer until eventually the front outran its own logistics. German officers believed that was exactly what would happen to the Americans in France. Their armored columns were advancing rapidly across the countryside, but every mile they moved forward meant another mile of fuel and ammunition that had to be delivered. And from what the German reconnaissance teams could see, those deliveries depended almost entirely on trucks that consumed the very fuel they were transporting. What the German officers watching those roads could not yet see was the scale of the system behind those convoys. Those trucks were not random supply vehicles moving independently toward the front. They were part of one of the largest logistics operations ever created during the war. The thousands of American transport trucks had been organized into carefully coordinated convoys that moved day and night along designated supply routes across northern France. Drivers rarely stopped except to refuel, repair damage, or switch shifts before continuing the journey again. Some trucks carried fuel in massive tanks strapped to their frames. Others hauled ammunition, spare parts, rations, and medical supplies for the advancing Allied armies. Every hour, new convoys joined the roads, while others reached forward depots and returned for another load. The movement never stopped. And while the German officer saw only a line of fuel-hungry trucks grinding across the countryside, American commanders understood something very different. Those trucks were not a weakness. They were the engine that allowed the Allied armies to keep moving forward without slowing down. Each convoy delivered thousands of tons of supplies directly to units fighting near the front lines, bypassing damaged railways and destroyed infrastructure left behind by retreating German forces. The system consumed enormous amounts of gasoline, but it also ensured that the soldiers, tanks, and artillery of the Allied armies never ran out of the fuel and ammunition they needed to continue advancing. Within a few months, German commanders would begin to recognize the true meaning of those endless convoys of trucks moving across the French countryside. Because while German armored divisions increasingly struggled with fuel shortages and broken supply lines, American forces kept advancing day after day without stopping. The trucks that German officers mocked as wasteful and inefficient were quietly proving something that would shape the rest of the campaign in Europe. As long as to understand why German officers laughed at the endless convoys of American trucks, It is necessary to look at how the German military believed war should be supplied. The German army had built its logistics system around railroads. For decades, German planners considered rail transport the most efficient way to move large quantities of fuel, ammunition, and equipment across long distances. Railways could move enormous loads using relatively small amounts of fuel. And once the supplies reached rail depots near the front, smaller trucks or horse-drawn wagons would carry them the final distance to combat units. This system worked well when the front line moved slowly and rail infrastructure remained intact. German campaigns early in the war relied heavily on this method. During the invasions of Poland and France, rail lines quickly followed the advancing armies, delivering supplies to newly captured rail stations. Trucks were used sparingly because they consumed precious fuel and required constant maintenance. German commanders were trained to treat fuel like gold because Germany did not possess large domestic oil reserves. Every drop of gasoline used by a truck was gasoline that could not be used by tanks or aircraft. For that reason, the German army often used horses to carry supplies, especially in difficult terrain. By 1941, the German military still relied on hundreds of thousands of horses to move artillery pieces, food, and ammunition along muddy roads where trucks could not operate effectively. To German officers raised in that logistical culture, the American approach to transportation looked wasteful and inefficient. When they saw thousands of trucks burning fuel while hauling supplies across France, the system appeared unsustainable. In their minds, the Americans were consuming enormous amounts of gasoline simply to keep their supply chain running. Eventually, they believed that fuel consumption would catch up with them. There was another reason German officers underestimated the American logistics system: their own experience with fuel shortages during the war. Germany entered the conflict with limited oil resources and depended heavily on imported fuel and synthetic production to keep its armies moving. As the war progressed, those resources became increasingly strained. German armored units often had to ration fuel carefully, and commanders were forced to plan operations around the availability of gasoline rather than purely tactical considerations. Tanks might remain idle for days, waiting for fuel deliveries that were delayed by damaged rail lines or destroyed bridges. When German reconnaissance units observed American truck convoys stretching across the countryside, they assumed the Allies would face the same limitations once their supply lines became longer. The logic seemed simple. The more trucks the Americans used, the more fuel they would burn. And if the trucks were constantly consuming fuel just to move supplies, then eventually those vehicles would drain the same resource they were trying to deliver. German officers believed that once the Allied armies pushed far enough beyond the beaches of Normandy, the entire system would collapse under its own weight. The front lines would move too far ahead of supply bases, and the fuel required to keep the trucks running would become impossible to maintain. In other words, German commanders believed the Americans were moving too fast and relying on a supply method that would ultimately destroy itself. What they did not yet realize was that the American system had been built around a completely different assumption. Instead of conserving fuel, the United States had built an industrial system capable of producing and delivering so much gasoline that the trucks carrying supplies could keep running almost without interruption. The convoys that looked wasteful to German observers were actually the visible surface of a much larger logistical machine. And as the Allied armies pushed deeper into France, that machine would begin proving just how powerful it really was. What German officers observing American truck convoys in France could not yet understand was that those vehicles were only the visible surface of a massive logistical system that had been growing for years on the other side of the Atlantic. While Germany entered the war relying on carefully rationed fuel and a transportation system built around railroads and horses, the United States approached the problem of logistics in a completely different way. American planners assumed that modern warfare would move quickly and unpredictably across large distances, especially once armored units began advancing deep into enemy territory. Railways could move large amounts of cargo efficiently, but they were also vulnerable to bombing, sabotage, and destroyed bridges. If rail lines were damaged, entire supply chains could collapse until engineers repaired them. Trucks offered something railroads could not: flexibility. A truck could leave a depot, they drive across open roads, bypass destroyed infrastructure, and deliver supplies directly to the units that needed them. The challenge was scale. To make a truck-based logistics system work, an army needed enormous numbers of vehicles, spare parts, mechanics, fuel, and trained drivers. For most nations fighting the war, producing that many trucks was impossible. But the United States had something that changed the equation entirely: industrial capacity on a scale unmatched by any other country in the conflict. American factories began producing military trucks in staggering numbers. Companies such as General Motors, Ford, and Studebaker converted assembly lines that once built civilian vehicles into massive production centers for military transport. One of the most important designs was the GMCCCWK, the rugged six-wheel drive truck capable of carrying heavy loads across rough terrain. Soldiers nicknamed it the Deuce and a Half because it could haul 2.5 tons of cargo in a single trip. The truck was designed for reliability rather than elegance. Its components were standardized, meaning damaged parts could be replaced quickly using equipment available across the Allied supply system. Mechanics could repair engines in the field, and spare parts were shipped alongside the vehicles to keep them operating even under difficult conditions. The real power of the American logistics system came from the sheer number of trucks being produced. By the middle of the war, American factories were turning out military vehicles at a pace that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could match. Hundreds of thousands of transport trucks were built during the conflict, and thousands of them were shipped overseas to support Allied operations in Europe. That scale meant the United States could afford to operate a supply system that appeared inefficient by traditional military standards. Even if trucks consumed large amounts of gasoline, there were always more vehicles available to keep the supply chain moving. And just as important, the United States possessed access to vast petroleum reserves that allowed fuel to flow continuously across the Atlantic. The tankers delivered millions of gallons of gasoline to Allied ports, where it was stored in massive depots before being distributed to the advancing armies. From those depots, truck convoys carried fuel and other supplies directly to the front lines. What looked like wasteful fuel consumption to German observers was actually part of a deliberate strategy: mobility over efficiency. American planners believed that if supplies could move faster than the enemy expected, the front line could keep advancing without pauses that might give the enemy time to reorganize. Trucks made that possible. They could travel wherever roads existed, adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, and deliver supplies directly to the units that needed them most. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France after the Normandy breakout, this truck-based logistics system began proving its value. The same vehicles that German officers mocked as gas-guzzlers were quietly demonstrating that a mobile army supported by a massive industrial base could keep moving long after traditional supply methods would have stalled. By the summer of 1944, the Allied armies advancing through France faced a logistical crisis that could have easily stopped their momentum. After the landings in Normandy in June, Allied forces fought a brutal campaign to break through German defensive lines surrounding the beachhead. When that breakthrough finally came in late July during Operation Cobra, the situation changed almost overnight. The American armored divisions suddenly surged out of the narrow Normandy front and began racing across the French countryside. German defenses, weakened by weeks of fighting and constant air attacks, began collapsing in several sectors. Entire German formations were forced to retreat quickly to avoid being surrounded. For Allied commanders, the rapid advance was both an opportunity and a problem. Their forces were moving faster than anyone had expected, and the further they moved from the Normandy beaches, the longer the supply lines became. Every mile the front moved forward meant another mile that fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food had to travel to reach the troops fighting at the front. Normally, railroads would have taken over much of that transportation burden. But in France, the rail network had been heavily damaged by Allied bombing before the invasion. Bridges had been destroyed, rail yards shattered, and large sections of track rendered unusable. German forces retreating across the countryside also sabotaged infrastructure wherever they could, further slowing any attempt to repair the railways. As a result, Allied supply planners suddenly faced a dangerous situation. Their armies were advancing rapidly, but the traditional supply routes that should have supported those advances simply did not exist. And German commanders watching the Allied breakout believed this problem would stop the advance sooner or later. They expected that American armored units would eventually run out of fuel and ammunition once their supply lines stretched too far beyond the Normandy beaches. Instead of slowing down, however, the Allied supply system adapted in a way that surprised German intelligence officers observing the battlefield. In August 1944, the Allied commanders launched one of the largest truck-based supply operations of the war. It became known as the Red Ball Express. The system worked by dedicating entire road networks exclusively to military truck convoys transporting supplies from depots near the Normandy beaches to the rapidly advancing front lines. Thousands of trucks began moving along these routes day and night, carrying everything from fuel and artillery shells to rations and spare parts. Drivers operated in continuous shifts, often driving for hours without stopping, except to refuel or repair damaged vehicles. The convoys rarely paused because the entire system depended on constant movement. Trucks traveling toward the front delivered their cargo and then returned along separate routes to collect another load. Roads across northern France soon filled with long columns of American transport vehicles, kicking up clouds of dust as they moved supplies forward at a relentless pace. The German reconnaissance teams observing these routes reported seeing convoys that stretched for miles, sometimes appearing as an endless stream of trucks rolling across the countryside. What the German commanders had expected to become a logistical breakdown instead became a massive demonstration of Allied mobility. Even though railways were unusable and the front lines were advancing rapidly, the truck convoys continued feeding fuel and ammunition to the units pushing eastward. The very system German officers had mocked for wasting gasoline was now proving capable of sustaining one of the fastest advances of the European campaign. The Allied armies had not outrun their supplies after the Normandy breakout. Instead, thousands of trucks were racing to keep up with them. For the soldiers fighting on the front lines in France during the summer of 1944, the success of the Allied advance depended on a group of men who rarely appeared in battle reports or victory headlines. They were the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, the men responsible for carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies across hundreds of miles of French roads to keep the Allied armies moving forward. One of those drivers was Private James Carter, a young soldier assigned to a transportation unit operating along the Red Ball supply routes. Carter's job did not involve storming enemy positions or flying combat missions, but the responsibility placed on his shoulders was just as critical. Every day he climbed into the cab of a heavy American supply truck, loaded with fuel barrels or ammunition crates, and joined the long convoys moving toward the front. The journey was exhausting. Drivers often operated for 10 or more hours at a time, guiding their vehicles along narrow roads packed with other trucks traveling in the same direction. Dust filled the air as thousands of tires churned along the highways and country roads connecting the supply depots in Normandy to the advancing American forces deeper in France. Carter remembered that the convoy rarely stopped. When one truck slowed down, the entire line behind it slowed as well, so drivers were expected to keep moving whenever possible. Some trucks traveled at night, with only dim headlights or blackout lamps to avoid becoming easy targets for enemy aircraft. Others rolled through villages where local civilians watched the endless stream of vehicles rumble past their homes. The drivers knew that every mile they covered carried fuel closer to tanks and trucks operating near the front lines. Without those deliveries, armored units would grind to a halt within hours. Despite the importance of their mission, then the drivers of the Red Ball Express worked under difficult and often dangerous conditions. German aircraft still operated in parts of France, and occasional air attacks forced convoys to scatter or seek cover along the roadside. Bridges damaged by earlier fighting sometimes had to be crossed slowly or reinforced temporarily by engineers before trucks could pass. Mechanical problems were another constant challenge. Vehicles carrying heavy cargo over rough roads were pushed to their limits, and drivers often had to stop briefly to repair tires, engines, or broken suspension parts before continuing the journey. But even with these obstacles, the convoys rarely stopped moving for long. Drivers like Carter understood that the speed of the Allied advance depended on their ability to keep supplies flowing forward without interruption. When a truck reached the frontline supply point and unloaded its cargo, the driver did not rest for long. The vehicle would be turned around and sent back along the route to collect another load waiting in the depots near Normandy. Day after day, the same trucks traveled the same roads, carrying gasoline, ammunition, spare parts, and food to the soldiers pushing deeper into France. For the tank crews and infantry units fighting near the front, those convoys became a lifeline. Fuel delivered by truck allowed tanks to continue advancing across the countryside. Ammunition ensured artillery units could keep firing. Food and medical supplies sustained the soldiers engaged in combat. The Red Ball Express drivers might not have fought enemy soldiers directly, but every mile they drove helped keep the Allied war machine moving. And as thousands of trucks continued rolling across the French countryside, the supply system that German officers had once mocked was proving capable of supporting an army that refused to stop. Behind the endless truck convoys rolling across France in 1944 stood something far larger than the supply routes themselves. The true strength of the Allied logistics system came from the enormous industrial capacity of the United States, which had transformed its entire economy into a machine capable of producing war material on an unprecedented scale. Long before the invasion of Normandy began, American planners understood that modern mechanized armies required vast numbers of vehicles to keep supplies moving across large battlefields. Tanks, artillery, and infantry units could only operate effectively if fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment arrived at the front without interruption. To achieve that goal, American factories began producing military transport trucks in staggering numbers. The automobile manufacturers that had once produced civilian vehicles converted their assembly lines into war production facilities. Factories belonging to companies like General Motors, Ford, and Studebaker began turning out trucks specifically designed for military logistics. One of the most important of these vehicles was the GMC CWK, a rugged, six-wheel drive truck capable of hauling heavy loads across rough terrain. Soldiers often referred to it simply as the Deuce and a Half because of its 2.5-ton cargo capacity. The truck's design emphasized durability and simplicity. Its mechanical components were standardized so that damaged parts could be replaced quickly using equipment available throughout the Allied supply system. Engines were built to withstand long hours of operation under difficult conditions. And maintenance crews were trained to repair vehicles rapidly in field workshops near supply depots. By the time Allied forces began fighting their way across Europe, tens of thousands of these trucks had already been shipped overseas, waiting to support the armies that would follow. The scale of American truck production changed the entire nature of Allied logistics. While German forces often struggled to maintain a limited number of transport vehicles due to fuel shortages and manufacturing constraints, The United States could produce and replace trucks at a pace that few other nations could match. By the end of the war, American industry had manufactured well over 2 million military trucks of various types. Many of those vehicles were sent to support operations in Europe, where they became the backbone of the Allied supply network. When trucks were damaged by mechanical failure, accidents, or enemy attacks, replacement vehicles could often be delivered quickly from rear depots. Spare parts flowed through the same supply routes as fuel and ammunition, allowing mechanics to keep large numbers of vehicles operating even under difficult conditions. This industrial capacity allowed Allied planners to adopt a strategy that emphasized mobility rather than strict efficiency. Instead of carefully conserving each vehicle, the system relied on overwhelming numbers to keep supplies moving forward. Convoys could operate day and night because there were always more trucks available to replace those temporarily out of service. The Red Ball Express itself eventually involved thousands of trucks operating continuously along designated supply routes across France. At its peak, the system was delivering thousands of tons of cargo to the front every single day. Fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts flowed steadily along the roads behind the advancing armies. For German commanders observing the Allied advance, the sheer scale of this logistical effort became increasingly difficult to ignore. The trucks they had once dismissed as wasteful machines were part of a supply network supported by one of the most powerful industrial economies in the world. And as long as that industrial machine continued, by the autumn of 1944, German commanders across the Western Front had begun to recognize something deeply troubling about the Allied advance. In earlier campaigns of the war, rapid offensives often slowed once armies pushed too far from their supply bases. Fuel shortages, damaged infrastructure, and exhausted supply lines would eventually force advancing units to pause, while logistics struggled to catch up. German officers had expected the same pattern to appear after the Allied breakout from Normandy. The American and British armies were advancing quickly across France, and German planners assumed that the distance from the Normandy beaches would eventually stretch Allied supply lines beyond their limits. But as the weeks passed, that expectation failed to materialize. Reports from reconnaissance units described roads across northern France filled with American transport trucks moving continuously toward the front lines. Columns of vehicles stretched for miles along highways and country roads, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts to the advancing Allied armies. These convoys did not appear to slow down as the front moved further east. Instead, the number of trucks on the roads seemed to increase. German intelligence officers studying the situation began to realize that the Allied supply system was operating in a way they had not fully anticipated. Instead of depending on railroads that could be destroyed by bombing or sabotage, the Americans were relying on mobile supply routes that could shift and adapt as the front lines moved. If one road became damaged or blocked, convoys could simply reroute to another path and continue delivering supplies. The flexibility of this system meant that the destruction of railways across France had not crippled Allied logistics as German planners had expected. For German commanders already facing fuel shortages within their own forces, this realization carried serious consequences. Many German armored units were struggling to maintain operations because fuel deliveries could not reach them consistently. In tanks and transport vehicles sometimes remained idle, while commanders waited for limited supplies of gasoline to arrive from distant depots. Meanwhile, Allied forces appeared capable of sustaining large-scale operations without the same constraints. German reconnaissance reports increasingly mentioned the endless convoys of trucks traveling toward the front, sometimes moving day and night without interruption. Even when German aircraft or artillery attempted to disrupt the supply routes, the sheer number of vehicles involved meant that the flow of supplies rarely stopped completely. Destroying a few trucks did little to slow a system built around thousands of vehicles operating simultaneously. German officers began to understand that the trucks they had once mocked as wasteful machines were actually the key to the Allied advance. The vehicles that seemed to consume enormous amounts of gasoline were also delivering the fuel that kept Allied tanks and aircraft operating at full strength. The system worked because it was supported by an industrial base capable of producing the trucks, fuel, and spare parts required to sustain it. By the time this realization spread through German command structures, the consequences were already visible on the battlefield. Allied armies continued pushing eastward across France, while German forces struggled to maintain stable defensive lines. The trucks that German officers had dismissed as inefficient had become the backbone of an army that could keep moving forward long after traditional supply systems would have broken down. By the end of 1944, the true impact of the Allied logistics system had become impossible to ignore. The truck convoys that once looked wasteful and inefficient to German observers had played a decisive role in sustaining the rapid advance of Allied armies across Western Europe. After breaking out from Normandy, American and British forces pushed across France with a speed that surprised even their own commanders. The cities and towns that German planners expected to defend for weeks sometimes fell within days as Allied units continued advancing eastward. Fuel delivered by truck allowed armored divisions to maintain the momentum of their offensives without waiting for rail lines to be repaired. Ammunition convoys ensured that artillery batteries could continue firing during major battles. Food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment arrived steadily behind the front, allowing soldiers to remain in combat without withdrawing to rear areas for resupply. The trucks that carried these supplies became a constant presence on the roads behind the front lines. Thousands of vehicles moved along designated routes every day, delivering the resources that kept tanks rolling and infantry units advancing. When the Red Ball Express itself eventually transported millions of gallons of gasoline and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies to forward units during the critical months following the Normandy breakout. For the soldiers fighting on the front lines, those deliveries meant that fuel shortages rarely forced them to halt their advance. Tanks could continue moving across the countryside, while supply trucks followed behind with the resources required to keep them operating. But the system was not perfect, and there were moments when supply lines struggled to keep up with the pace of the advance. But compared to the logistical limitations faced by many armies during the war, the Allied supply network proved remarkably resilient. For the German army, the contrast became increasingly painful. While Allied forces pushed forward with steady streams of fuel and ammunition arriving behind them, German units often faced the opposite situation. The fuel shortages became one of the most serious problems affecting German operations during the later stages of the war. Tanks that could have been used to counter Allied advances sometimes remained idle simply because there was not enough gasoline available to move them. Transport vehicles and supply trucks faced similar shortages, making it harder to move ammunition and equipment between different sectors of the front. As the war progressed, German commanders were forced to conserve fuel whenever possible, limiting the mobility of their forces at a time when rapid movement could have been crucial. Meanwhile, the American logistics system continued delivering supplies to Allied units with remarkable consistency. The trucks German officers had once mocked as gas-guzzling machines had become the backbone of a supply network capable of supporting one of the largest military campaigns in modern history. Though their engines roared across the roads of France day and night, carrying the fuel that kept Allied tanks moving and the ammunition that allowed Allied artillery to continue firing. In modern mechanized warfare, victory often depends not only on weapons and tactics, but on the ability to sustain those forces over time. The United States had built a logistical system powerful enough to do exactly that. And in the end, the trucks German officers once laughed at became one of the reasons the Allied front never ran dry. The trucks German officers once mocked became the lifeline of the Allied advance. They carried the fuel, ammunition, and supplies that kept the front moving. As the Allied advance across France continued through late summer 1944, It became increasingly clear that the truck-based logistics system was doing more than simply keeping units supplied. It was changing the way the war was being fought. Traditional military planning assumed that armies would periodically slow down while supply lines caught up to the front. Tanks and mechanized units consumed enormous amounts of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts during combat operations. And once those supplies ran low, commanders were forced to pause their advance while logistics units reorganized and delivered more resources forward. This pattern had shaped many earlier campaigns of the war. Even the highly mobile German blitzkrieg operations relied heavily on rail transport and carefully planned fuel deliveries. When supplies could not keep up, armored units were forced to stop regardless of battlefield opportunities. But the American truck network supporting the Allied armies in France created a different possibility. Instead of waiting for supplies to move slowly along damaged railways, commanders could rely on thousands of trucks delivering fuel and ammunition directly to forward units every day. This allowed armored divisions to operate with far greater flexibility than most armies had previously experienced. Soon, tanks could continue advancing as long as supply convoys were able to reach them along the expanding road network behind the front. As a result, Allied forces were able to maintain the momentum gained during the breakout from Normandy. Instead of pausing for weeks to rebuild supply lines, the advancing armies pushed forward continuously across large sections of northern France. Fuel trucks arrived at forward depots, carrying the gasoline required to keep tanks and transport vehicles moving. Ammunition trucks ensured that artillery units never ran short of shells during major engagements. Food, medical supplies, and spare parts followed the same routes, allowing combat units to remain in action for extended periods without needing to withdraw for resupply. German commanders, watching the Allied advance, began noticing that something unusual was happening. Their expectations that the Allied offensive would eventually slow due to logistical strain were not being fulfilled. Even when American armored columns pushed dozens of miles beyond their previous positions, supply convoys continued arriving behind them. Reconnaissance reports described roads filled with trucks moving toward the front in carefully organized columns, delivering resources faster than many German planners believed possible. This steady flow of supplies allowed Allied forces to maintain operational pressure across wide sections of the front. German defensive positions that might have stabilized the battlefield were instead forced to retreat repeatedly as Allied units kept advancing with fresh fuel and ammunition. In effect, the truck-based logistics network allowed the Allied armies to operate in a way that resembled a continuous offensive rather than a series of short advances, followed by long pauses. For German forces already struggling with fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure, this development created an increasingly difficult situation. Their own armored units often faced strict fuel limitations that restricted movement and forced commanders to conserve resources whenever possible. Meanwhile, the American army, supported by thousands of trucks, appeared capable of sustaining rapid movement across the battlefield for far longer than expected. What had begun as a logistical solution to the destruction of French railways was gradually transforming into a strategic advantage. The mobility of the Allied armies was no longer determined solely by the speed of their tanks and vehicles. It was determined by how quickly the supply convoys behind them could keep delivering the fuel that made those vehicles move.